We're not pastors or missionaries. We didn't go to seminary school. We're actually photographers and have done a number of other things career-wise. And so it doesn't really make sense that our family would have been in Haiti for 5 years. But we were asked to come and photograph some sponsored children. The number one thing we were asked for were Bibles. And so we started a mission called Bibles for Haiti. At that point, we were not thinking that we would be the ones to bring Bibles into Haiti. We thought, well, partner with other mission organizations, the professionals, the educated, the scholars, those that are planting churches. And we had some really dear friends of ours that said, why can't you pave the road, make some connections, and, just see where it goes, see what God does with it.
Welcome, everyone, to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And we're delighted to be here. We have an excellent guest for you today, definitely in this track of being extraordinary and ordinary type episode. But there's a story here that really is quite extraordinary. And so we're really excited to introduce you to our guest, Carrie Elliott. Carrie Elliott, welcome to the Be Unbound podcast. It is a delight to have you here. You have hosted us in your home, for me, at least twice, if not three times. And so really appreciated that. You've come and helped us with some of our events. Of course, Abby you got some family connections in terms of Unbound. But I had you on the podcast because I think you just have a really fascinating story of Christian service, ranging from the kind of exciting in terms of overseas missions, and then to maybe in some ways more impactful, if not as exciting, in terms of just your ongoing walk of faith and the kinds of things that you and your family have done. And so I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. And as we were saying before we started recording, Carrie has not only agreed to do this, she's agreed to do it like twice because my schedule messed up and I had to reschedule her. So not only has she done it, but she was persistent and sort of sticking with us. So thanks and welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys today. It's good to see you guys. Haven't seen you in a while.
Well, and last time we saw you, you were a little bit busy because she was the mother of the bride, and we were definitely not the people that she needed to be talking to. And it was a gorgeous wedding, and we were really honored to be there. So I gave a little bit of a synopsis there, but tell us a little bit about how you got to the Be Unbound podcast, Carrie.
Well, I guess it would have to be because of my daughter, who Abigail has done Ascend 2022 or 2021. Actually, I can't even remember what year she started Ascend. Maybe 2021. And through all kinds of different events, through the Ascend program and her Ascend project, which is what you alluded to earlier, Jonathan, why you ended up in South Dakota. It just so happened that she was throwing a masquerade charity ball for her Ascend project, and it happened to be the same weekend as the homeschool conference here in South Dakota. And so I guess, I don't know, we got to meet face to face, got to meet your team and start to establish a relationship, which was awesome. And I got to see many of the team members that were helping Abigail through that first year of Ascend, which was so much fun. We saw so much growth, but anyway, that led to you guys inviting Dan and I, my husband, to Apex the following year. So anyway, I just think through conversations and through a relationship, and you decided to invite us back. So I guess that's a good thing. Hopefully we have something good to share with somebody that's listening today.
Well, it was an easy decision to invite you back. So I looked at this background earlier, but Carrie, you've got all kinds of interesting things going on. And it was really fun to be at your house and see all the different things that you do and that Dan does and all that. But one of the things that, is part of your story that certainly catches people's attention is that you had a really interesting experience serving in Haiti. And that is something that lots of people can say that they've done, but it's particularly interesting now with Haiti going through a particularly difficult and tough time. And so tell us a little bit about that experience, because you started when I visited your house with that a little bit. I mean, you didn't lead with it, but as we got to discussing and knowing each other, you and Dan shared about that. And there were just so many stories in there that stuck with me in terms of how you got to Haiti, some of the things that went on there. And it's not exaggeration, Carrie, to say that, frequently in my life, throughout the week, recently dealing with a situation I just called Dan to ask some advice about recently. I've thought about some of the stories that you told about Haiti and some of the experiences that you had. And so it's definitely had an impact on me. So tell us a little bit about how you got to Haiti and how that all worked out.
It was definitely an experience for us because bringing us to Haiti, we're not pastors or missionaries. We didn't go to seminary school. We're actually photographers. and have done a number of other things career-wise. And so it doesn't really make sense that our family would have been in Haiti for 5 years. But we were asked to come and photograph some sponsored children that were going to school, and that's how we initially went to Haiti. But it was in 2010 that we went 3 different times that year. And long story short, our last time there, we definitely felt compelled to stay there, and we were asked for the number one thing we were asked for were Bibles. And so we started a mission called Bibles for Haiti. At that point, we were not thinking that we would be the ones to bring Bibles into Haiti. We thought, we'll partner with, other mission organizations, the professionals, the educated, the scholars, those that are planting churches and all. And it seemed to be harder than we thought. And we had some really dear friends of ours that said, why can't you maybe go down there and lay some foundation and pave the road, make some connections, and, just see where it goes, see what God does with it. And we thought, oh my word, that we are not the ones that should be in Haiti. But we thought, we will pray about this. And we had a photography studio that we had built our home onto it. And the realtors are like, well, this will never probably sell. And so we thought, well, if the Lord wants us there, maybe it'll sell. And we started going down that road of thinking and praying, like, if it's going to happen, the Lord will make it happen. He will open the doors. And it did sell within a couple of months, actually. And so we found ourselves in Haiti in 2011 and founded Bibles for Haiti and worked with local pastors and missionaries there, bringing Creole Bibles into the country. And so they could actually have discipleship groups, and we just wanted to support the local church. And we didn't know how long we would be there. It ended up being about 4.5 years, and it was an amazing experience. We do have a lot of stories to share. And I think because we were just layman Christians who love the Lord, our experience is probably so drastically different than many other people's experiences, because we are just average, untrained, but we love Jesus. And so I do think Christ equips every single one of us to, share his story with the world. And that was kind of what we did on mission, and we shared God's word. We ended up doing a lot of things. We farmed, and we did Bible studies, and we did English classes, and we did kids clubs, and we did lots of other things as well, that God just kept opening doors through doing real life in sharing the gospel, honestly, and just through doing laundry, because everything you do in Haiti is hard. And so, but it's also done in community. And I think that was the biggest thing that we learned, is the more we're in community, the more opportunity we have to share God's word with people, and just to show not just God's word, but do life. And as you do life with people, the gospel is on display through hardship and through trials and through suffering and through joys and weddings and, all the fun things of life too. And so it was really an incredible experience for our whole family, actually.
Well, thanks for giving the overview. When you told this story originally, one of the things that struck me, and I want to kind of go back and go over this a little bit, was that, okay, so you're photographers, and I appreciate you kind of bringing that up, that you love Jesus, but you weren't photographers that loved missions. So you got to Haiti through a photography assignment, not because you had this deep calling in your heart to be missionaries. I've heard you and Dan tell this a couple of times, and you bounced through it pretty quick, but you talk about your photographers who build a studio. And so let's just stop and say that most photographers are not talented enough to generate enough money to build studios. And so that in itself, just for the audience, Dan and Carrie are photographers like Smithsonian, National Geographic, art gallery level, photographers. I mean, they're not just sort of like, they kind of do it as for fun. I mean, in every aspect of this, professional storytellers through images. And so you do this, and you get to the point where you build this studio, which, if you're listening carefully, was a dream studio for you guys, that a dream kind of outcome. And then you kind of say, and if God wants us to, then we'll sell it and we'll leave. I know you're not living in a studio right now. And so there's a bit of a bigger story there. So what was that process? Because I think that's a pretty interesting shift. And I think the part that's interesting to me is that you're doing something that you love, something that is difficult, not something that's easily obtainable. It's not like a sort of 9 to 5, go plug in and do this and climb the corporate ladder. I mean, it takes a lot of creativity and work and effort to build that kind of freelance photography business. And you did that, which many would see as kind of God's blessing and confirmation on your path. And then you abandoned that. So if you would just talk a little bit about how that process worked itself out.
That's also an interesting story, Jonathan, because Dan and I were both in the corporate world. We did not start on this path. We went to college and, I finished, Dan did not. I was probably more like very career driven as a young woman, young married woman. We were married early at 19 or young at 19. And photography was not, Dan's always taken pictures, but it wasn't a career calling for him. It wasn't until, a little bit later when we started having kids, we were both working so much and we were making good money, but we had our quality of life wasn't very good. And Dan had this passion of photography, and we did build a small business just doing pictures and Dan is the photographer. I do shoot. Everything I have learned is from Dan. But I think it's so interesting because Dan doesn't have any formal education outside of the 2.5 years he went to college. But yet he is extraordinary in everything he puts his mind to. And he has he's taught me in the photography world, but he really is the photographer and I'm his sidekick. So I help him, and it has blessed our family for almost 25 years. We've been able to make income from this, but it didn't start off that way. It was, the short story is we really made peanuts, and we built from the ground up of just photographing families and friends in our local community. But we started getting so busy with our corporate jobs, working, 40, 50, 60 hours a week. And then Dan's doing photography on the side, often 30, 40 hours a week. It was ridiculously busy. And we had to make a decision. Which path are we going to choose? Are we going to set down the photography, or are we going to set down corporate life? And so, we decided to set down corporate life. It was actually me that quit my corporate job first to stay home with our daughter, Abby, who went to Ascend eventually. But I came home, left the corporate world, and I became a stay-at-home mom. And we thought we'd probably have to set down the photography because Dan wasn't going to have any time to do all of this. But what happened is the photography kept just blowing up with business, and he was also able to leave his corporate job within 11 months of me quitting mine. So we went from two incomes, really decent incomes in the corporate world with all of the security and health insurance and all the things. And we owned a house at that point too, to living off of Dan's photography income. And that was it. And that was the scariest time in my life. But I was also a very new Christian in that season. I became a Christian at 26. And this was probably I was probably about 28 years old at this point. And I, for the first time, was really depending on the Lord to just like show up and provide and sustain. And not that God always answers in such material, tangible ways, but my prayers so much changed from, as we were leaving the corporate world, from, Lord, if I can just keep my house, and there's such immature prayers. But I'm like, Lord, please, I want to stay home with my baby, but like, I don't want to leave my house, to eventually like, okay, Lord, whatever your will is, we'll walk in it. And through that, we did end up keeping the house. We ate peanut butter and jelly for many, many months and didn't know if we were going to afford diapers. But we went from that, and the photography business grew. And it was honestly 2 to 3 years from that point that we were so busy. And our studio that we had rented I say rented, but we had a friend letting us use it for free. It flooded 3 times. And so with sewer, by the way, it was a basement studio. It flooded 3 times, and we literally were just like, "What do we do?" It was the middle of our busy season, and so we just did not know what to do, and so we just kept pressing forward and praying and looking at opportunities, and eventually we're like, "Okay, we don't know where to go from here," and we ended up Dan. If he was here, he would tell the story. Just so sweet. Actually, I'm going to go get a little bottle real quick. I'm going to show you this. We might have shared this before, but this little bottle has dirt and rocks and prayers, and we have literally had this bottle since probably, 2006. Whenever we built the studio. I don't know. It's one of those years. And Dan was actually on a piece of land. He's like, Lord, I don't know what to do. My studio is flooded again. We're in the middle of this season and we don't know what to do. We either need to shut down shop or whatever. And he knelt down. He had this water. He was actually drinking this water bottle before it was filled with all of this stuff. But he put dirt and grass and rocks and all this stuff. And he's like, Lord, this land, everything you own. And he knelt down and he prayed that God would provide a way for us to just move forward. We honestly, at that point, didn't know what to do. We didn't know if we should build. We didn't know if we should rent. And then he called a friend of my dad's who owned a lot of different land. And he just asked the question, like, do you have any land available that we could possibly look at purchasing, even though we don't have any money? God is good. And I'm not saying that it just landed in our lap because we had to work really, really hard. But God opened a number of doors for us to walk through, and we got SBA loans, and we sold the house and put all the equity that we made in it, which wasn't a ton, but it was during the mortgage boom. So we did make a little more than we probably should have. And we put everything into building this studio. And we lived with my mom at one point, my dad at one point. With small children, we're literally uprooted, have nowhere to live while we're building the studio. We're like, what are we doing? We're literally sinking every penny we have into this studio. And we're homeless. And we built the studio, and it was a year later we built our home onto the studio. But honestly, as we built that studio, our business grew like 300%. We're so busy, and so we were never like wealthy, but we're able to make ends meet. And so it was crazy how God did. We never had planned to do that, but it was just through a series of events that caused us to, we either had to close up shop, or, we have to be in the studio that keeps flooding with sewer, or we look at other options. And so this was the option that was the path we went down. So I don't know. That was a really long story, and I'm sorry I had to go get my water bottle, but we still hold this today because it is such a reminder that God is so much bigger than any of our fears and any of our anxieties or just all of our uncertainties, because oftentimes we don't know what to do, but we just keep moving forward and we're trusting. And this is just evidence of God's faithfulness over and over, not just one time, but repeatedly in our life.
We had a conversation recently, and I was just talking with somebody and said that I think we undervalue those in our current society, those Ebenezers that we raise, and that they're not some ancient, weird, historical thing that doesn't happen anymore. Like by physically putting up those reminders, by having the water bottle, because we drift otherwise. We forget. We don't remember. And yeah, we've just had some of those conversations recently, and I was thinking in my own life, just some things that I was thinking I need to put up these things. And I'm actually in a new building that we're turning into not a photography studio, but a recording studio and an office and things like that. And I've been sort of thinking I need to put those things up so that I see them every day and I don't forget about what God has done and where we've come from. So I think that's actually really helpful, Carrie, because that sets the stage, right? So God answers all these prayers, and he does all these amazing things, and he takes you places you didn't think you'd go, and the business grows 300%, and you've got the house and you've got the studio. Then if I'm outside, I'm saying, great, how much more endorsement do you need to know that God's telling you to run a photography business? And then he sold it. And so you told us the story, but after you sold it and you went to Haiti, and a little bit about how you got to Haiti, but I'm just kind of curious about that moment. Mm-hmm. Where did you go from, thank you, God, for providing this miraculous set of circumstances that allowed us to build the studio, to we're abandoning this studio and doing something different? Because I think for many people, your story would be the arc, right? We were burnt out, we were going the wrong direction. We walked away from corporate America. We came home. We started something. We went to the edge of our abilities. We prayed. God answered that. Then he blessed, and then we were able to step into it, and now we're being able to serve him. That's a compelling story. And yet, that's just the preamble. Like, that's the introduction to the book. And then chapter 1 is, we sold the studio and we went to Haiti. So when was it that for you personally, when was it when you were at peace, or did you ever come to peace with selling the studio and taking that next step?
That's a good question. I think because of our Ebenezer, because of how it happened, we did not take ownership necessarily of the land that we bought or the studio that we built. Even though Dan, he designed it, we built it, we worked really hard for it. We loved it. We thought we'd be there, all the days of our life. We thought we'd be raising our kids there. We specifically built the home on because we also homeschooled, and we just designed it for everything that we desired our home to look like. Anyway, yeah, we just didn't feel like we had ownership over any of it. Even though we worked really hard for it, we knew that God's hand was all over it. And from the very, very beginning, this is such an indicator to us that the Lord, he has ownership over all things. He is creator over all things. And, and we are to steward whatever he gives us well. When the Lord gives, and then sometimes the Lord takes away. And so regardless, we rejoice in whatever that season looks like. I know it was really hard for my family to understand because they knew how hard we worked for that space. And they knew we loved that space. We did a ton of ministry in that space also, besides just our photography. So we just hosted all kinds of things there. But we never felt like we owned it. And so as our hearts were opening up to missions, and it was actually Logan, our oldest, he was 8 at the time. Him and I went to Juarez with a mission organization. And that was really what broke my heart for missions early on. That was probably, gosh, I don't even want to say a year, probably 2008 maybe. But my husband had never been on missions. He's done, work, like he did some work when Katrina hit New Orleans, and he was always a big advocate of like, let's support, but he never thought, well, you have to go overseas to be a missionary, and unless you're called to do those things. But, we have neighbors right around in our local community that don't know Christ. And so that he was really passionate about being a missionary in our community that God planted us in. Well, ironically, they called him, the mission organization called him specifically to go to Haiti as he was praying about, like, Lord, open my heart and help me see my wife's broken heart for missions, because I did have this passion growing and building in me. And he just didn't understand it. And so he actually went to Haiti by himself the first time in 2010 and came back a completely changed man, honestly. And so not that we were going to then go do mission work, but I think God just opened up both of our eyes to this global world that he is sovereign over all of it, and we might think that, okay, he's just planted us in Brandon, South Dakota, and this is our little area of influence, but he blew that up, and we were looking for it. We got exposed to it, and then it's like, once you see, you can't unsee, and so it radically changed both of us as we started seeing and pressing in and learning and praying and talking to all these other missionaries, and then of course when we went in 2010 3 times as a family, that is really when it's like, we felt ourselves letting go. Even though we weren't even hanging on to the studio, we just let go more and more and more. And like, okay, if we need to sell it, we'll sell it. And that's kind of, I don't know, it was almost simple. And it sounds really awkward to say, but it wasn't a struggle to put it on the market. And the irony is full circle now. Our studio has been sold a couple different times because we're now back in Brandon, South Dakota. We moved back in 2016. And the studio's been sold a couple times, and now it just got sold again. And we weren't really happy with like the last 2 people that have necessarily bought it, because they just did all kinds of things. We're like, okay, we don't own it, whatever. We almost bought it back again, or like, we don't need to do that. But this last time, it's so crazy because it's actually somebody I went to high school with, and they are Christians, and it's like everything about the studio is a perfect fit for them. Everything that Dan designed is completely perfect. And we just shot their senior pictures, her daughter's senior pictures, last week. And we've done a number of things for them photography-wise. But she just came to my door today and says, we would love to put Dan's artwork all over the studio, which they have now turned into their insurance company, which is incredible. It's just an incredible story. But she loves Dan's artwork and wants to put South Dakota artwork all over the studio. And I just think, God, only God can make a story like that be so amazing, because Dan has always wanted to have a gallery or do something like that where his artwork was on display. And now it's going to be on display back in the studio that he built. that, it's just great and beautiful and wonderful.
I feel it's almost criminal to jump over. Like Haiti got this little mention at the beginning, and now we're gonna sort of leapfrog it. I feel like we should probably bring it back to a series of podcasts on Haiti with Dan probably, and with your kids. But there's another part of your story that I've heard that was really interesting. So you go to Haiti. I think the way you've described it is you were transformed by Haiti, but almost in the same way that you gave up the studio, you gave up Haiti. It didn't sound to me like a tragedy or a crisis or anything else, but there was a clear, it's time to go back. And so when this couple of years ago, which would have been a little closer to when you returned, not that long ago, but you said you came back in 2016. That's not awfully long ago. And it's probably 2 years ago that I talked to you about this. And then I think you kind of said it was a struggle to come home. So you didn't come home to the studio. You came home. I think you didn't say this, but reading between the lines, it didn't sort of strike me that Haiti was financially advantageous for your family. So I don't know that you built any nest egg when you're in Haiti. So you come back to your hometown now with this completely different perspective, this brand new sort of having lived your faith out in these really amazing ways, which is, often unique to a lot of different missions fields. And now you're back in your hometown. And so tell me what that's been like, because that was the part of your story that was really intriguing to me when we sat in your living room and you shared that.
Yes. Not only are we back in my hometown, Dan's from Wyoming, but we did live in Brandon, built the studio in Brandon. But yeah, not just back in our hometown, but we're actually back in my home that I grew up in. Yeah. So this is the house I grew up in. We lived here when I was 4 years old, and my parents were divorced when I was 8, and both of them lived in Brandon, though. And my mom, as we moved back, she has a basement apartment, and so we moved in with her in the basement apartment for a time, but it ended up, when we were in Haiti, it got harder and harder for her to maintain the home. And she was actually quite adamant that we stay in this home, and she wanted to find an apartment. And so she actually spent a few years living in, actually just down the road from, like half a mile away from us here. And yeah, living back in my old neighborhood. I mean, literally all of the it is kind of surreal that we're back in this neck of the woods, and God has completely just brought us full circle to living here and staying here. And now my mom is actually back living with us because of some health issues. So now she is living in the basement apartment. She just moved in June, actually, after Abby and Abe's wedding. And so that has been a whole new season of life in caring for her and supporting her as we're really working hard to get her healthy and all of that. And so, yeah, I guess I love being back in this house again. And I think we're planning to stay here. We've just made it a home. We keep growing in our community here and everything. So yeah, it's been incredible that this is where we landed again.
It strikes me that you said this when we talked before, and you just alluded to it here, that Dan was kind of like, hey, we need to minister to people in our neighborhood. There's people in our neighborhood that haven't heard about Jesus. And then all of a sudden, your heart breaks for missions, and then Dan is transformed, and then you go, and then you get some really intense missionary training and some really intense faith training and some really intense experiences. And now you're back, and it's almost like, it's Haiti. It was a means and end to itself. I'm not saying that it was, a tool for something else. I mean, obviously what you did in Haiti had major impacts and major work there. And yet in some fashion, it seems like it's uniquely trained you to bring you back to, in some ways, a much more challenging mission field at home. But almost, I would think that you're back in the neighborhood you grew up in almost as aliens in terms of your experience and where you've been, and now equipped in such an interesting way to engage and to serve the people that you're around. So, well, Carrie, thank you. Your story has impacted me. I heard it, how many years we were back there, and it's not many years, but 2 years ago, I think. And I think about it quite frequently. It comes up a lot. Of course, at Unbound, we talk about being extraordinary to ordinary. And I talk so much with young people who are so desperate and so starved for finding that meaning and purpose. And I thought your story was so interesting as people who found meaning and purpose and strove and prayed and had answered prayer and has your model and got that, and then quickly put that on the altar and led them to someplace else. And then that led to someplace else that you weren't sure about. And in some ways, I think even more than I talked to you last time, sound a lot more at peace with the kind of work you're doing. You just said that you're more engaged in your community and you're doing these things than you were even a couple of years ago when we were there for the ball. And I think that's a beautiful testimony and journey. And I appreciate you taking us along and sort of giving us some insight along the way. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Well, it was a pleasure and an honor. And like I said, maybe we'll have you back and we'll do a whole podcast on Haiti and get all the Haiti stories sometime. So.
I know there's so many.
I think we'll just leave a teaser. I think the one that stuck in my mind was Dad laying a motorcycle over sideways to go underneath a tree or a wire or something that was across the road in the dark. And as somebody rides motorcycles, that definitely made an impression and stuck in my head. So, yeah.
Well, and the thing about that story is Abby was on back of the motorcycle.
I did remember that as somebody who has small daughters. I did not forget that part.
Yeah, I did not forget that part.
I'm sure. So
I think that was one of those moments where he's like, all right, let's not tell Mom this one.
We'll tell Mom later. I didn't say we wouldn't tell Mom. I just said we wouldn't immediately tell Mom.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Well, Carrie Elliott, thank you so much. It was a pleasure, and I really appreciate your witness, your faithfulness, and your willingness to share the story so we can learn from it as well.
My pleasure. It's nice seeing you guys again. Thank you.
Well, I'd heard pieces of that story before, David. There is so much there that I think is powerful. We spent a little bit of time after the recording stopped talking to Carrie. And for those of you who are listening, I don't want to go over the conversation again, but I do want to elevate this piece of it, especially if you're a young person listening to this or parents of young adults. I get this constantly. We just got back from Apex, and we got this almost the entire way through Apex. There is this deep sense among at least American Christians, if not wider, that in order to really do God's work, you have to figure out what this special thing is God has for you to do, and then do it. And then you'll be able to live inside God's will and satisfy Him. And you'll hear a story like Carrie and Dan's, where they strive after and lean into and abandon the corporate track and do it for their family and do photography and then ask for the miracle and get the studio, and you will stop there. And that's not the end of the story. And I think the part that I really want you to think about, reflect on, maybe even pray over, is then Carrie and Dan's leaving all that and going to Haiti, and then leaving what they had in Haiti and then coming home. And now continuing on some of that work before, but in a different fashion. And there is a process of that sort of leaving one thing and being called into the next that is more of a hallmark of the Christian life, of the practical Christian life, than this idea that a miracle is granted and you live happily ever after doing God's work in this particular way that you're really gifted for. There's almost always a continually letting go and being called up into something that's harder and different, and then ultimately ends up being wonderful and fantastic. And meaning wonderful and fantastic inside the faith, inside of what God's calling you to do. And I think Carrie's story was a beautiful testament to that. And it's worth pausing and thinking about, not that your story is going to be exactly like Dan and Carrie's, not that the same sacrifice is going to be required, not that the story is going to be the same, but there are definitely patterns to pay attention to.
Yeah, I really appreciated how there was so many elements of that story where you could have just looked at that and so just thought that's an amazing testimony and that's a cool, like such a blessing in and of itself. But I think so often we hold so tightly to those blessings whenever we get them, whenever we have finally reached a point that we have prayed for, that we have asked for, and yet at the same time, God calls us to hold loosely to all of those blessings He's given us, because He doesn't call us to enjoy His blessings alone. He calls us to enjoy His blessings and to obey Him, and His blessings are going to look different at different points in life, and that's just something that I think we often miss, in that we seek only after the end goal, the individual blessings that we're really looking for, and we miss out on all of the other things that God can give us that aren't necessarily the ideals that we had in mind along the way. And it's a really humbling perspective, and one that is a lot easier to have with, I think, a bigger breadth of perspectives like the Elliots have, but it's one that's very worth remembering.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this story and hearing Carrie's testimony, as it were, and her story, and found it as inspirational as we did. By the time you hear this, I'm not sure exactly when we're going to air this, David, but it's going to be really close to the final piece, the final end of our enrollment period for all of our fall programs. And so that would be Equip for high school students, Explore for high school seniors, and Ascend for post-high school. But we do enroll folks in those programs still at the very end here. For those of you who come into Explore and Ascend, we did have Apex last week, so you will have missed that. But Apex next year will be included in your tuition package, and so you will be able to experience that event. And of course, Base Camp is right around the corner in November, and so our next live event is coming up. And every year we have a dozen or so students in Ascend who enroll after Apex and get started with everything. And we have some latecomers into the Equip program all the time. And so it's not too late to do that, but it's almost too late. And so we're encouraging you to, if you're thinking about that or still considering that or reconsidering that, there are still opportunities to get in and to get in this year. And maybe one last thought about that. We did just get back from Apex. About 2/3 of us are sick, which is not necessarily unusual coming back from Apex, including David, who is soldiering on here. But every Apex is a blessing. Every Apex is a lot of fun. We've talked about it a lot in this program. This was an extraordinary event. It was a special event in all the ones we've gone to. It is an extraordinary body of young people. This is a group that, if you listen to us for a while, we're very biased, but that we think is special and stands above and stands out in so many good ways. Even among groups like this class has been extraordinary. Their response to the content, their attitude at the event, their behavior, their interaction with each other was just really, really special in all the good ways. This is a mature, passionate, dedicated, interested, curious group of people. And we could use some of those things to describe many of our Ascend classes, but this one's got it in spades. And so it's been really fun to just have this quick week with them here. We're really looking forward to Base Camp. I got to do the first Ascend webinar last night. That was exciting, and the energy was still really pulsing from Apex. And I guess what I'm saying is that if you have any doubts about the future, I can tell you that there's a place to stand that looks a lot more hopeful, and it was at Apex this year. And if this sounds really interesting to you, don't miss your opportunity to jump in. There's still time to get enrolled. So thanks very much, and until next time, be unbound.